Thank you for joining us today, Keiser University Multidisciplinary Center, as we present Student-Centered Learning, presented by Dr. Diana Martin.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. I'm happy and excited to be here and to share ideas about the way our professional practice is changing and evolving. First slide, please. Well, as you may know, you probably know, Dr. Miller and her team are very organized and careful planners. And when we first scheduled this, it was December of last year. And at that time, the only thing I knew about the term corona was the glow that came from the sun that we talked about during a solar eclipse and a brand of beer. So we have now a new meaning, and because of that, you will see at the end of this, I've added a postscript to talk a little bit about how our teaching has changed since we've been sheltered in place. We have the next slide, please. Let me see, I'm seeing the polling slide. Okay. So the first thing we're going to talk about, let me just check. Dr. Miller, I still see the polling slide to our program. I'm going to begin by talking about cybernetics. And the reason for this is that teaching and learning is changing because of our access to and use of the internet. Whether we're teaching in a face-to-face classroom or whether we're teaching online classes, our minds and the minds of our students are changing. And these changes are because there's a new kind of communication. So I'm going to start by talking about some research that explains to us 3 ways the human mind is changing because of a new kind of communication. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, we have a little bit of a delay, but that's all right. Are you over age 30? If you are, there's a man named Mark Prensky who will call you a digital native. And the digital natives are those of us who grew up in a world characterized by technology. The internet's only been around for about 30 years. But as we all know, it's made vast differences in the way we communicate and the way we learn. Prensky calls us all either digital natives, if we've been around 30 years or less, or for the rest of us, including me, digital immigrants, those that migrated to this new land of digital realities. For all of us, we've grown up in a role or changed to a world that is more enriched by virtual reality. There's a lot of information that comes at us, and we're more governed by group norms. And what do I mean by group norms? Well, if you want to buy something, and you're like most of us, you'll go online to see the reviews. You might participate in a group where you find out what people like by a thumbs up and thumbs down. You might look at YouTube if you want to learn how to do something. So there's a new way of exploring information, and it has changed not only us, but the way we learn things. The biggest part of this has to do with the way we communicate. And there were 3 people, I don't have a picture of them, but let me tell you more about them, that I think changed this most of all. The first one was a while ago. It was a man named Marshall McLuhan. And he wrote that the way we communicate is in itself part of the message. He said the medium is the message. So when you communicate online, there is a part of the message that's different than if you write a letter with a pen and ink. There is something in the message itself that's different. And McLuhan wrote about that. We'll talk more about it. Then a man named George Siemens came along, and he wrote about something called connectivity. And connectivity has to do with the way we relate to each other. Remember I was talking about that thumbs up and thumbs down? That we check more with each other, and we check more information than we used to when we make decisions and when we learn. The last one, John Suller, who's still alive, is a cognitive psychologist. And he talks about something, we're going to talk about 3 of his ideas, 3 of many, called cyber psychology. Cyber psychology. And it involves communication and how our minds act differently because of the way we're processing information. May I ask for the next slide, please? All right, so the first of the 3 ways. The first way, and we talk about this in getting students involved in the education itself, which all who are teachers know how important that is. The first term is called engagement, the first of the 3. And engagement says to learn, the student has to be connected to what's going on, feel connected. It's a feeling thing. They have to want to be part of it. Gagne way back talked about this by getting the attention of the student. But now what it involves more of is making the student feel like they're part of the process. The idea of this is to try to reduce the feelings of isolation, that the student does not feel alone, that the learner does not feel alone. If you remember from school, Newton's laws of gravity, this is my interpretation. Suller did not say this. He said that the farther apart the bodies are, the less the attraction. And I think that holds true for learning. If your students don't feel like they're there, if you can't get them to be there, they're not going to learn. So a goal for engagement is to make the student not feel isolated. And the method to do this is to enhance, improve communications, and build a sense of community. And we'll talk more about this, but some ways to do this is use the student's name a lot, repeat back what the student has said, either if you're doing it in things like threaded discussions or if you're doing it in something like this webinar, you recognize the value of what the person has said and who the person is. You name the person, and you try to get the person, the student, the learner, to reveal something about themselves. Next slide. A second of the 3 is identity. Identity online, it's important in classrooms, but it becomes magnified online because who we are is not visibly evident. When I began this PowerPoint, I was looking at pictures of the team that was helping me. And they were looking at my face against my will. And it still gave me more a sense of identity because it is not clearly evident in online learning who we are. We are who we say we are. In online communications, we are who we say we are. You can use the best picture of yourself. No, that people can't see your face. They don't see all the nonverbal communications you're sending out. And so one of the things in teaching online and teaching in the classroom that makes it more student-centered in either case is what Suller calls the integration principle. We have to try to help both in what we communicate about ourselves and what we know about our students, putting together the online self, the way the person is representing himself and herself, and the offline self, the authentic person that individual really is. We try to put together the online identity with the authentic identity. And we can do that through introductions, through conversations, through questions that are more personal. We know this works because as educators, we know self-concept, who we think we are, and self-efficacy, how well we think we can do in learning, have an impact, are impacted by, and have an impact on our achievement and also the motivation. So those are the first two ideas. Next slide. The last of the three for today is digital literacy. Digital literacy. And we talked a little bit about how much information is coming at us. There is, for today's student, for the digital immigrant and for the digital native, too much information. Reality, that what we know is both expanded and limited. It's expanded because there's so much of it. And that in effect limits it because you can't handle all of it. And it's also limited because not all of it is accurate or true. So learning what's true and what's accurate is more of a challenge for all of us. If you think about your grandparents, or in some of our cases, our great-grandparents, what they look to know something, and then to learn something, were teachers, professors, maybe encyclopedias, libraries, things about stayed the same. And it was harder to get more up-to-date information. Now everything is dynamic. It's moving so quickly that we have to teach our students to be able to challenge the sources and take out of that information we're getting the ability to construct what's accurate or what will help us. So in the digital literacy, we're dealing with massive amounts of information. And then that connectivity that I talked about earlier with Siemens, you might use kind of a collective knowledge like thumbs up, thumbs down, or YouTube videos, or online evaluations, or you might use other people, which is also basic to student-centered learning. Other people to try to find out if the information is real, is reliable, and is accurate, is valid. All right, let's compare these three things to what it used to be like. May I have the next slide? Doesn't she look like she's conducting an orchestra there? I found this old photo. There's a 1950s teacher. And at first I thought they were memorizing something, but then I looked at the book and it looks like, I think they're singing something. But the old time image of a teacher in school, this really reflects that kind of perfect order. I'm surprised they're even all holding their books the same way. And they're all speaking the same way, and they're probably saying whatever it is she wants them to say. It was based on rote memorization. It was based on, this is the important stuff you have to know to be a grown-up. It was based on, I tell you what you need to know. And that was the old sage, the wise one, on a stage, standing in front of those perfectly ordered desks. What we're transforming to now, and these are not my words, that's why they're in quotation marks, is a new guide at the side. And one of the authors I was reading about said it this way: learning is not about passivity and order. Look at how passive those students look and how well ordered the rows are. It's about a messy process of discovery, finding out what's real, and construction. And that's Dewey's idea of construction. You've probably run into construction, putting together your own information. Next slide. What we're talking about today is student-centered learning. And when I began writing this back in December, it was about something that is happening in the traditional classroom, in the face-to-face classroom. But whether it's happening in a traditional classroom or in a digital classroom, some of the functions and the ways it operates are the same. It's based on constructivism, putting together information instead of receiving it, and transformative. That means it lets us take the information and change it to fit new realities. And the most important thing is that students more fully participate in what's going on. And the thing that scares most of us is this requires for the learners to share power with their teachers. The teachers are beside them, not in front of them, in deciding how they'll learn. So hold on just a minute. The way this has evolved in a large part has come from what we know about cybernetics, because it has changed communication, it has changed power. Next slide. There's a person named Weimer, Mary Ellen Weimer, who wrote a book called Learning Centered Teaching. And she talked about 5 changes that I think sum this up really well. What's interesting is the basis of this is that the process becomes more important than the content. The process of teaching becomes more important than what we teach. Why is this important? Because what we're teaching in terms of data and facts is changing. And not only is it changing, but we know it immediately. But the way we learn or the way we deal with the facts still should operate well. So the 5 changes she talks about are changes in the role of the teacher, which we just talked about a bit, changes in the balance of the power, more power in terms of student involvement, changes in the function of content. Why do students have to, need to, want to learn something? It makes students more responsible for learning, and it redefines the purposes and processes of assessment and evaluation. The last thing has to do with how we measure what people learn, and whether we have something called assessment of learning, whether they learn something, or assessment for learning, whether by learning, by assessing what they learned, we learn even more. Let me give you an example. In one of my classes, I was trying to talk about assessment, and I found, I'm good at finding old stuff, and I found an old video by, at that point, I mean old, it was before my time, before your time. It was an old video by, I think it was called Southern Bell, and it's now called AT&T, but it wasn't even called AT&T yet. And it was a woman, and it was a training film. And it was a training film about how to dial a phone. Yes, there used to be phones that you had to dial. And she begins, she has a perfect ponytail, and she has an oversized, what is it called, rotary phone? Anyway, a dialing phone. And she's telling the learners in this group, it looks like it's a corporate learning video, about how to dial. And she says, first you begin with the area you're talking about. So it would be like ringling, so it would be RI. And she dials the dial, and then she says, now it's very important that you let the rotary go back to its starting place, or you may get a wrong number. I'm not going to go into great detail about that video. But the point is, what she was teaching was relevant at the time, and so is now so not relevant that it's laughable. It's funny to watch. It's entertaining. And that's what happens if we rely too much on content, particularly in the new environment where we have access to everything immediately. And that can be a great responsibility, not just for the teachers, but for the learners. Have the next slide, please. May I have the next? There you go. Thank you. All right, so here is some of the research that we found out about student-centered learning. First, it's enjoyable. I'm going to tell you in a minute what some of the challenges are, but once they get over the challenges, both students and teachers have reported that they do enjoy it. Second, it leaves, this is a strong one. Students perform better when they use student-centered learning. And I'll give you an example in my classes. When I teach online classes, we have something that's not unlike what we're doing today. It's called, it uses a platform instead of Zoom. It uses a platform called Collaborate. And most of us that are teachers, we stand, not literally, but we have our PowerPoint up, just as we're doing right now. And we do a PowerPoint to explain something. The students can ask questions, they can raise their hands, they can talk, that sort of thing. But it's still more teacher-centered. I have a colleague, and this is not my idea, but it's an excellent idea, that got tired of being the one who was running all these collaborates. And she decided to introduce a couple of assignments in the 8 weeks that we have that are our course, where students presented the information. They were student-led collaborate sessions, and they received credit for presenting instead of writing a paper. And it was a little scary. I decided to do it, but I didn't know where we were going to go. I didn't know if they'd go off topic. I didn't know if they would present something that was silly or was irreverent or just didn't apply. And they did a great job. In fact, I had some of the students in another class and they demanded that I added an assignment like that. It was popular, but more importantly, when I had those same students in another class, inevitably they referred back to the topic they had covered by presenting. They had seen my presentations, but their own presentations were the ones that they remembered. So according also to the research, the last one, sometimes you cover less content if it's student-centered because it takes longer for students, for example, to do a presentation. But the students seem to be learning more. And this again is the research-based information. Next slide, please. All right, what are some of the, I'm guessing that you have already in your mind said, yeah, but what about? And some of the challenges that you would assume to be true are in fact demonstrated by research to be, when they did surveys, to be challenges of the student, that the faculty recognized as a problem. Student-centered learning is more work and more planning, and because all students aren't alike, it requires different levels of responsiveness according to the needs of the students. When you stand up and you, especially if you teach a topic for a while and you're an experienced teacher, you know what you're talking about. And you can pretty well, even if you have group meetings and you involve your students, you orchestrate the direction and the content. And in student-centered teaching, it's a little more chaotic. They might take it off in the wrong direction, and you have to give up that control. Also, students themselves are afraid. They're not used to this. And so they ask questions like, I don't understand what my teacher wants. What do you want me to do? That seems to be something students get over, but it is a challenge. Some students may not be developmentally ready, either chronologically or in their developmental stages for student agency to make the decisions on their own. But in a minute, I'm going to show you some simple ways we could start. You don't have to start all at once with total student agency to enjoy some of the benefits of student-centered learning. And lastly, kind of what we started with, power and trust issues. It's even if you trust your students and even if they trust you, it's going to go off direction. It's going to be less planned. It's going to, if you're a stickler to doing everything on time and exactly as you plan, this will make you go out of your mind because sometimes for good reasons, you have unexpected findings. You have good results that you didn't expect. And sometimes you have bad results you didn't expect. In assessment, when we're talking about these challenges, what we try to stress, how do we know if the student learned something, is assessment as learning. We try to design ways to measure learning that the activity in itself teaches, like a group project, for example, instead of assessment of learning. It doesn't work as well with multiple choice tests. It's more like an essay exam than a multiple choice test, but even less structured than an essay exam. Next slide. So this has all been pretty theoretical. Let's look at some specific examples of student-centered learning and teaching resources. And these are from online sources. So with, next slide, please. With youngsters, next slide, please. Thank you. With youngsters, a lot of times what you're doing is a kind of formative assessment where you figure out how much they know as you go along. And that, here's 3 examples. The first one, think, pair, share. And you may have already done this, but you didn't know it was student-centered learning. You can ask students individually about a question for about a minute, and then you ask them the question, then ask them to turn to their neighbor and talk about ideas, and then they share the ideas with each other and come up with an answer. You can also do this in groups of 3 or 4. It works well with small groups, and it works the best if the teacher then has the group report to everyone else what they came up with. Another one is similar. It's kind of like the old game of gossip without the messing up the data. You ask a group of students a question, and the first student, and you can, it's kind of like creating a Google Doc too. The first student writes and shares his or her answer, and then the next student adds to that, and then the next, and not more than 3 or 4 students with youngsters. And that turns into something that is reported to the entire group. You can even have the entire group decide which presentation was the best. And the last one, the last example, are minute papers. And you ask, this is a formative assessment on your ability as a teacher. And you can see these sources are old. This is not a new technique, but it does feature student-centered learning. You ask them what was clearest or most significant, which makes them use their cognitive abilities, metacognition, to assess the content. You ask them what was the most interesting or most surprising thing they learned, and then what they still have questions about. And that's a good formative assessment for teachers to use for remediation activities. So if you find with your particular students a reoccurring question, or even with one student, a question that indicates more work, more help is needed, it centers on the individual student's needs. And an example, I had one of my students who teaches in allied health. When her students come into class the first day, trying to picture this subject because it's not one I would teach, she gives them 1 minute to write down on a piece of paper everything they know about blood Yes, I said blood. And then she has them switch papers with the person next to them so they come up with the longest possible list in basically 2 minutes, the first minute and then the combined minute. And what that does is a couple of things. First of all, they learn from each other. And secondly, it gives the teacher a good start for the course content. And what about older students or more advanced students? They don't have to be old to be advanced. How do we switch the focus from the teacher to the learner? How do we make sure the information is dynamic rather than static? And how do we enhance collaboration? Well, 3 examples that you can find in the literature, and there are many, many, many more. There is a website on here listed, Peer-Led Team Learning Workshop Project. And there's some interesting ones out of Harvard University Project Zero. The first one is peer-led team learning. And you let the students facilitate cooperative learning groups. And in this case, as in the other 2, you give them a question, but you don't give them the answer. That's the basis. They find the answer. And the best way to do this is to explain up front that there is not one answer. You can't go on the internet and find the answer. The questions should be written in a way that they evoke critical thinking. The second one, there's not an explanation for the next 2 because hopefully they're clear to you, is in the courses itself, you introduce opportunities for inquiry. In other words, instead of giving the information, they seek out the information. And they may have to seek out information that, again, isn't a single answer. It's more about what they find would work. When I do these, the best way to do it is to create a very specific situation so that it is unique to the assignment rather than something that you can go out there and find in the too much information library of the internet. And the last one is case studies. And a while ago, I taught in MBA courses for another institution. And case studies are very well known in MBA courses. You give them the situation and let them solve it. And oftentimes there is a case study that was an actual situation without the resolution. We used to use the Apollo 13 crisis as a case study that students had to come up with an answer to. Now, we've talked a little bit about student-centered learning and how it operates in general. Now I want to talk about, if I might, next slide please, the postscript I talked to you about. And the postscript is teaching and learning environments have been disrupted by the pandemic. Next slide, please. Thank you. The pandemic has changed a lot. And so 2 things happen. One, a lot of folks that weren't teaching online all of a sudden have to teach online. And a lot of students, either they're having to learn online or they can't learn at all, and they're learning with their parents, and they don't have access to online. So I started thinking about what students and educators are reporting about the new normal caused by the pandemic. And the first thing I did, I found an astounding number. UNESCO reports, and I got this number maybe last week, so it's pretty recent, in the world, not in the country, in the world, school closures because of COVID have impacted 1.2 billion students, billion with a B, in 186 nations. Now, this does not mean that all of these students are online. Some of them have no access to education. Some of them have no access to running water. But it is transformational. I believe that for years we will be dealing with the outcome of this interruption or disruption. And because I teach teachers, some examples are, I have a student who teaches in Washington, D.C., who did what some of you may be doing, was called upon with her mask and her gear and her gloves to hand out laptops to students so that they could use them to learn. I have a student who is teaching 5-year-olds kindergarten in Brooklyn, New York, and the class size of her kindergarten student class doubled. I can't even imagine teaching 5-year-olds online. You'd have to be very entertaining. But her class size doubled because another of the teachers was COVID positive and was in the hospital. I have a third student who told me a story. She's in Florida teaching. I'm in Florida. And they gave out laptops, as my first student did in this example. And she learned one of the students did not have a laptop, which my first reaction, me as a person, Diana Martin's reaction was, that's terrible. And then she found out, the student, my student, found out the parents had sold the laptop because both parents were out of work and they needed the money for food. So it is a very scary time for our students. You talk about social emotional learning. There's more to this than just how do we teach. May I have the next slide, please? I think there's a little delay. Thank you. All right, so again, this was maybe a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. I'm a member of PDK, a number of you may be also, it's a professional teaching organization. And this year, like as in last month, they did a survey of 200,000 educators, 200,000. Because it's a professional organization, these are all people in education. They might be administrators, they might be high school students studying to be teachers, but it is restricted to people that intend to or have made teaching their profession. And it was just a survey, not a study, to see how they're doing. May I have the next slide? Think back about what we talked about connection and engagement and how it's important. 70% of the respondents said, and these are the student respondents, said that if their school wants them to feel connected, that it will be critically important for teachers and staff to communicate clearly with them. Now that sounds obvious, but it is not. And you go back to how you communicate, how often, how personal it is, and how do you engage the student and recognize the student. Next slide, please. The results of the Phi Delta Kappa survey are that the people that conducted the survey, the educational professionals, said the social emotional needs of students and adults need to be attended to before academics. It was their belief, after reading the responses from these educators and administrators and students, that the most pressing need was social emotional needs. And this reflects back of what some of the things are we're learning about identity and engagement and connectivity and communication in the new cybernetic connected universe. Next slide, please. This is another finding of the study. When face-to-face interactions are not an option, schools need to find other ways for students to stay connected with each other and enable teachers to respond to students' full range of needs. I would submit that this is very well this very well fits student-centered learning, because when the students are part of the process, they are more engaged. If they're working in groups, if they're collaborating, if they're constructing their own knowledge, you're meeting more of their social economic needs. Social emotional needs. So the focus back on our first three: engagement, student-centered focus, construction of knowledge, and identity, are congruent with those things we're talking about when we talk about cybernetics, as these have affected student learning. And I have only two more slides to go. I didn't find this in a book. This is my observation. There is a distinct relationship between student-centered learning and the needs of the new digital native. Remember, the digital native does not necessarily mean they're learning digital. It means they have grown up in the world of technology. The first is connection. Research describes the importance of the teacher's role in helping students believe they are connected to classroom activities. And look at the age of that. That's an older source. And yet it still stands true. The connection is related to student-centeredness. So connection. The second, emotional support. I did some research. I published a paper on this. And one of the studies was that students today expect a classroom environment that is emotionally supportive. And that's what we saw in those responses, the 200,000 responses to that survey, is they want more than to learn. They want to know they're part of something, and they want to feel they're supported. And especially if you're counting on student agency. May I have the next slide, please? There you go. Thank you. If they're counting on student agency, it's scary. It's scary to take responsibility for yourself. So that involves the emotional support, the second. The first was connection, the second, emotional support. And the last is engagement. Students who experience connection with the virtual community, and that could be in the classroom, in a real classroom, and they link to other sources online, or it can be in a cyber community. Those students tend to want to stay in school. And one of the problems we have with the new digital learners, some of them are not in class. And some of my teachers that teach high school are having trouble rounding up their students, because just because you give them a laptop, it doesn't mean they engage in the class. So the three themes are the digital dimensions of information, student-centered learning, and the survey of students that were quickly thrust into distance learning underscores the importance of the connection, emotional support, and engagement. And the next slide, please. I have enjoyed talking with you. I hope you'll let our engineers, my engineers, know if you have questions. And I think this is a pretty powerful quote. It's about letting the students discover rather than the teachers cover. Thank you.